This is 6 News. Our top stories this hour: scores killed and hundreds reportedly injured after 2 Israeli strikes on schools in Gaza. Corridors filled with solid waste. The WHO says Al-Shifa Hospital has essentially stopped functioning as a medical facility amid power outages. Also this hour, Labor re-elected in Dan Andrews' former seat of Mulgrave, despite a swing against them, with the Liberals saying the government has been sent a message. And Australia condemns an unsafe and unprofessional run-in with a Chinese warship, while the PM speaks on trade at APEC in San Francisco. Good evening. Dozens of people have been killed after 2 Israeli strikes on schools in Gaza. The UN-run Al-Fakura school was hit late at night Australian time, followed by another strike later in the day on a different school. Thousands of people are housed at the buildings due to the war. The Palestinian Health Ministry saying hundreds were injured in the strikes, with at least 50 people killed. The World Health Organization, meanwhile, has said Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza has essentially stopped functioning as a medical facility amid power outages. In a statement, they said, quote, "Lack of clean water, fuel, medicines, food and other essential aid over the last 6 weeks have caused the hospital, once the most advanced and best equipped referral hospital in Gaza, to essentially stopped functioning as a medical facility." The team observed that due to the security situation, it has been impossible for the staff to carry out effective waste management in the hospital. Corridors and the hospital grounds were filled with medical and solid waste, increasing the risk of infection. Al-Shifa Hospital can no longer admit patients, with the injured and sick now being directed to the seriously overwhelmed and barely functioning Indonesian hospital. All patients on life support at the hospital have died, according to a hospital official speaking to Al Jazeera. 24 patients died over a 48-hour period as of Saturday morning Australian time, according to the hospital and the health ministry. Thousands of people have taken to streets across Australia as part of pro-Palestine demonstrations. For the 6th straight week, crowds gathered at the State Library of Victoria in Melbourne calling for a ceasefire. Crowds also turning out in Sydney and Brisbane. Dozens of Labor Party branches in New South Wales have also joined calls for a ceasefire, according to Labor Friends of Palestine New South Wales. At least 29 branches want an immediate stop to fighting. Several Labor backbenchers have also called for a ceasefire, while the federal government has used language that is not called for a ceasefire, but they have said they wanted a humanitarian pause. The Greens and the Daly and Frank Carbone Network MP Daly are among the federal MPs who support a ceasefire. The Victorian Labor Party has been re-elected in the state seat of Mulgrave in a by-election last night, despite a swing of more than 10% away from them. The by-election was triggered by the resignation of former Premier Dan Andrews. Labor suffered a swing of more than 10% on primary vote, but retained the seat against both the Liberals and high-profile independent Ian Cook. It means no changes to the composition of Victoria's lower house since before Andrews resigned. Labor with a clear majority at 55 seats, the coalition at 27, Greens on 4 and independent Labor MP Will Fowles being the remaining 1. 6 News election reporter Maggie Perry has the details.
It was a pretty average result. They got a 5% swing away on the 2-candidate third result right now. The Liberals should finish second, but the VEC have made a bit of a mistake by putting Ian Cook second. And so they've conducted the count between them. So it will change. But right now, 5% swing. Dan Andrews was an incumbent for 21 years, Premier for 9. I feel like this is a pretty average result about what Labor expected, because he must have had a big personal vote from Mulgrave. It's a bit interesting that Ian Cook kind of underperformed. A lot of people were expecting that he would finish second, the Liberals wouldn't really try, but he's fallen back to third since the election where he came second. The right-wing vote is also pretty middling. Family First, Libertarians, they're both at 3%. It's pretty low result. The thing is that the 11% primary vote didn't exactly translate into preference justice. Victorian socialists, especially, even some of Ian Cook's will flow back to Labor. So really, the primary vote isn't a very good indicator, because it's just more of a case of more options on the left rather than just Labor and the Greens.
Gerry, a former minister in the Hawke and Keating governments, has died. Hand served as Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and later Minister for Immigration in his 10 years in Parliament as the member for Melbourne. In a statement, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says he joins with others in offering his condolences to all those mourning the passing of Hand, saying he understood better than most just how hard the road could be in political life. Hand was 81. Australia has condemned an unsafe and unprofessional run-in with the Chinese warship. The interaction left Australian military divers injured. 6 News National Affairs editor Austin Pollock has the very latest.
Signs of a rebuilding relationship. Anthony Albanese and China's President Xi embracing, chatting and laughing at the APEC summit in San Francisco.
We reiterated the stabilisation that is occurring.
6 News understands that Albanese spoke with President Xi on Friday about remaining trade sanctions on Australian exports, including lobster, beef and wine. All the while, his government formally makes complaints following a serious incident happening a week after the PM's visit to China, but days before the summit even began. Timed, it seems, to keep the PM from having to comment on the incident, which could harm his new relationship.
I wonder if they didn't want the Prime Minister to be asked in San Francisco whether or not he had raised this with Xi Jinping.
This veneer of stability comes at a price of silence from our leaders and danger to our military.
The Australian government says a team of divers have been deployed in international waters off the coast of Japan inside the exclusive economic zone to help remove fishing nets from the Australian ship's propellers. A Chinese Navy destroyer vessel was in the area at the time and advanced before receiving a warning from HMAS Toowoomba that there were Navy divers in the water near them and were asked to keep clear of the area. However, the vessel continued to approach regardless, then operated its hull-mounted sonar, forcing the Australian divers out of the water but injuring them, likely due to sonar pulses. Defence Minister and Acting Prime Minister Richard Marles saying in a statement, Australia has expressed its serious concerns to the Chinese government following an unsafe and unprofessional interaction with the People's Liberation Army Navy destroyer. Australia expects all countries, including China, to operate their militaries in a professional and safe manner. China has form when it comes to military incidents with foreign countries. There have been 180 incidents in the past 24 months where United States aircraft have been subject to dangerous and threatening conditions from Chinese aircraft. This number hoping to be significantly cut down. This week, the two military superpowers agreeing to restart military-to-military communications.
America's commitment to the Asia Pacific is unwavering and, in our view, from America's perspective, essential.
The question now is, how does this latest running with the Chinese warship impact the PM's new relationship? Austin Pollock, 6 News.
The son of South Australian Police Commissioner Grant Stevens, Charlie, has died in hospital after sustaining an irreversible brain injury following an alleged hit and run. In a message released via SA Police, Stevens and his wife Emma thanked all police staff, first responders and other emergency service workers who attended the incident and thanked the wider community for their support. Police say the 18-year-old male driver was arrested and charged with causing harm by dangerous driving, aggravated driving without due care, leaving the scene of a serious crash and failing to truly answer questions. He's been refused bail and will appear in court tomorrow. New polling shows a full third of voters supporting a non-major party. The latest data from YouGov shows Labor has taken a hit, down 2% to 31%, and the coalition is steady at 36%, although the ALP has retained a narrow 51-49 two-party preferred lead. The Greens are at 13, down 1, while One Nation is at 7, and Independents and Other at 13, equating to 33% of voters. Last election, Labor had 32% of the vote and the coalition 35% nationally. The next federal election is likely to be held in 2025. Sentencing for defence whistleblower David McBride is expected early in the new year after he pled guilty to 3 charges of stealing and unlawfully sharing secret military information. The material was passed on to ABC journalists who used it as the basis for an investigative series exposing war crimes in Afghanistan, known better as the Afghan Files. 6 News GovCheck reporter Aidan Edgecombe has the latest.
David McBride has pled guilty to 3 charges of stealing and unlawfully sharing secret information. So this happened back a while ago in 2018. He released information to the ABC, which led to the development of the Afghan Files report detailing alleged war crimes and alleged illegal killings in Afghanistan. So he went to court for this just this week, and he had a number of setbacks in his trial. So the Commonwealth government intervened to argue key evidence couldn't be released and he couldn't use it in his trial due to national security reasons. And the justice found that his oath to protect and serve Australia didn't hold up as a public interest defence for the information he released. So based on this, he's then pled guilty to the charges. They still have avenues to appeal based on the court striking down evidence he was going to use and public interest defences. So this may not be the end of the case itself, but in terms of sentencing, he is likely to face jail time. He said publicly himself he's likely to face jail time, and it is an interesting situation for the government. They've committed to certain whistleblower protection reforms. They were quite critical of the Morrison government and opposition regarding whistleblowers. So obviously it's a matter for the courts, but whether legislation may be pushed through in the future and have a retrospective impact, I don't know. But currently it looks like the most likely scenario is McBride will be facing jail time for his actions. In terms of future whistleblowers, it may very well be off-putting for other people. There's been a lot of talk, obviously, not just this, but in other cases about the conduct of our military and an intense public debate surrounding that. So the robustness of it is quite certainly a major thing. But for future whistleblowers, seeing what's happened here and seeing how the public defense has been striked out and the oath hasn't been taken as a legitimate reason to leak certain things, it may well deter other people from doing this in the future. We saw earlier, I believe, this year or last year with Bernard Khalili, the prosecution getting dropped. So that was a positive sign for many, and perhaps a lot in the whistleblower protection in that sort of space were quite pleased with that. But you could argue for them this is quite a major setback and will have many implications regarding whether people in future are willing to blow the whistle on these sort of instances. And the precedent that's set, there's going to be a debate on either side, but in terms of what can and can't be released, it's a pretty clear line in the sand.
The United Kingdom government is continuing to hold off calling an early election despite calls which have ramped up following Monday's sacking of Home Secretary Suella Braverman and the subsequent appointment of former Prime Minister David Cameron as Foreign Secretary. For more, Six News spoke with UK Liberal Democrats MP Alistair Carmichael, who was in the government when the Conservative Party had a coalition agreement with the Lib Dems following the 2010 election.
For the Conservatives, it was probably quite a clever piece of news management. We would all have been talking about the resignation of Suella Braverman as Home Secretary, but for the fact that David Cameron then walked down Downing Street. I think the Suella Braverman sort of denouement is still to come. I think we'll hear a bit more from her. But, Rishi Sunak looks a bit like the political equivalent of the boxer who manages to duck the jab, only then to get caught flush in the chin with a right hook coming in. Because, yes, it got him out of a difficult corner yesterday, but actually, I think having somebody like David Cameron in cabinet again as Foreign Secretary probably creates as many handling problems for him than it solves, arguably more so.
It's quite extraordinary to see what's happened to the UK government since the 2019 election. Even by Australian standards, it's a lot of prime ministers that have come and gone. Do you think, and I know there's been one letter of no confidence already, do you think Rishi Sunak can last until the next election, whenever that may be next year?
Hey, look, you're asking me to predict what's going to happen inside the Conservative Party. If you'd asked me to predict what would happen yesterday, I wouldn't have got much of it right. I think it is almost unthinkable that the Conservatives could change their leader for the third time in one parliament without having a general election. So I think, for good or ill, then Sunak probably limps on until the next election. From the national point of view, from the point of view of the national interest, we have a prime minister who is limping on, and he lacks the authority within his own government. I suspect strongly that he didn't want to do that reshuffle yesterday. He would cheerfully have left it until maybe next month when he was past the autumn statement. But he was forced into it because he lacked authority. He was being challenged by his own Home Secretary. And as a consequence, you had a day of turmoil that's just going to keep producing more turmoil at a time when we are trying to rebuild our economy after the hit it has taken from the COVID pandemic, the cost of living crisis that we went through last year with the spike in energy prices. And now we still see we have a war in Ukraine and the Middle East on the brink of a conflagration. This is a time when actually you need a strong functioning government. And what we've got is almost the polar opposite of that.
Now, of course, you've been in Parliament for quite some time. You were in when it was the Lib Dem Conservative coalition as well, and so much has happened since then. We just talked about the number of prime ministers. In terms of you observing it in the House of Commons, the state of the Conservative Party as it's gone from, well, you've been in Parliament even before 2010, from when they were elected back in 2010 to now. How has it, I guess I want to use the word deteriorated as an observer on the opposition side?
I think deteriorated is an exceptionally kind term to them. I think probably implosion or disintegration would be nearer the mark. Look, David Cameron, for whatever faults he had, understood that you can only govern Britain from the centre ground, and he tried to mould the Conservative Party into a centre-right party. But ultimately, they turned on him and they consumed him, and he was not able to continue. Since that time, most of the moderate mainstream Conservatives who came into government, came into the Conservative Party at often the prompting of David Cameron, have simply just got disgusted and walked away from it. And what you've got now is a fairly hard right, almost sort of Tea Party light Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. And, I think David Cameron will struggle. He has been quite open in the recent past about the areas where he has disagreed. And especially actually on foreign policy, he's coming into a job where he has a very different record in the past. Engagement with China is one area that particularly springs to mind from the position of the current government and the position of, I would say, the overwhelming majority of Conservative backbenchers. So is he going to actually stay in a post where he thinks he can mould things, or is he just going to stay in a post for the sake of it?
It is extraordinary because the House of Lords and how that system works, they can just slot him in, and that seems bizarre in most other countries, including here, where there needs to be a vacancy and you need to be up to an election. But that's a whole different story we can go on to. No, go ahead.
That's a historical anachronism, really. And the last time we had a job as important as this filled by somebody in the House of Lords was Lord Carrington when he was Foreign Secretary until 1982. The world has changed massively in the last 40 years, and I just don't think it's acceptable anymore that you have a Foreign Secretary at a time when there are some massive foreign policy challenges, both the acute, immediate in Ukraine and in Gaza, and then the chronic, our relationship with China, and MPs cannot stand up in the House of Commons and question him because, for all the faults of the way the House of Commons works, and there are many, one of the things that actually makes a difference and which works well is the ability of MPs to eyeball ministers across the chamber and to say, why have you done this? Why did you get that one so badly wrong? And, he is going to make mistakes. There's no doubt about that. It's all fine yesterday, but when the hard days come, he's going to need friends, and I don't see where he's going to find them.
In terms of, we were just talking about election there, it is, extremely likely it's going to happen next year. They won't push it to January 2025. What do you think is going to happen there in terms of, I guess, Conservative losing is the expectation. But for your party, the Liberal Democrats in particular, what would you, I guess, like the outcome to be? And I'm sure you'd like to retain your own seat as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's always my first priority, and I never take it for granted, even though I have a seat that has a long history of support for Liberals and Liberal Democrats. For the party as a whole, you see us coming back. You see us coming back in those areas where we previously were very strong, in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, the West Country of England, but also gaining support and having real prospects in some areas around what we call the Blue Wall, those traditional Conservative supporting seats around the home counties around London. So there are opportunities for us to make big advances. Look, we could take nothing for granted. We've had disappointments before, but it feels now like there is a genuine mood for change in the country, and that's an opportunity for us as Liberal Democrats. I've said a number of times in the last few months that it doesn't really matter what Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives do now. They've just lost permission to be heard by the population. And they can thank Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng for their catastrophic mishandling of the economy for that, because at the end of the day, people are not really that interested in who's in, who's out, who's up, who's down. What they do care about is that when they come off their fixed rate mortgage and they're going to have to fix for a new rate or go into a variable rate mortgage, then they're looking at paying £400, £500 a month extra because of these catastrophic misjudgments. A wise man once said, "It's the economy, stupid," and he was absolutely right. Once we win a seat, we dig in. We never see it as a short-term project. And if we do win these blue wall seats, my goodness, you can believe me, you will have Liberal Democrat MPs working night and day to make sure that they stay in our column and that they don't go back. Boris Johnson achieved something quite remarkable in 2019. He managed to win votes and seats, both in the post-industrial Labour seats in the northeast and the northwest, while holding on to those seats around the blue wall with very different messages. What I think the Conservatives have never properly done is to give the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn sufficient credit for what Boris Johnson achieved. An awful lot of their traditional, mainstream, moderate, pragmatic support in those blue wall seats, the people who are not particularly ideological but have supported the Conservative Party because they saw them as a route to some sort of political and maybe even social stability, they were absolutely horrified, but they held their nose and they voted for Boris Johnson. Well, Jeremy Corbyn's no longer the leader of the Labour Party. There are a very different Labour Party on offer now, and we as the Liberal Democrats are back as a political force offering another choice in these seats. And I think that Rishi Sunak is going to have to, I think basically he does not have the Boris Johnson capability of holding these two constituencies together. And in fact, the way he's going about things, I think he risks losing them both.
Just quickly, because I get the feeling that some in the UK might be really, really sick of hearing about politics and hearing about government at the moment. But at what point do your party start to really jump in with campaigning, especially also in, I guess, the targeted seats, because you want to avoid, Labor or another party getting in, and then you can have a split vote, which could get the Conservatives back in.
Look, it's one of the realities of modern politics that campaigning never stops, especially in a marginal seat. And, we've been employing staff, we've been spending money on campaign efforts in these marginal seats. It's very tightly focused effort. We fight what we call a ground war rather than an air war. And, I think one of the interesting straws to pull out the wind from yesterday is that there are quite a number of what you would call sensible, capable, intelligent ministers who just quietly walked away. Now, that to me says that they're looking to a future beyond life as a government minister, possibly even beyond Parliament. They need a 6-month quarantine before they can start looking for jobs outside politics. So they're clearly thinking that we're having an election sometime next May, and they don't particularly rate the long-term prospects of the party. This happens. You saw it happen with the Labour Party. You saw it happen with the Conservatives under John Major. The ambitious people who want to get on in politics, if they think their party isn't a vehicle for their ambition, they will quietly go and do something else. I think you're seeing that in the Conservative Party in Britain at the moment.
All right, now back at home, here's a look at the top stories in Perth with Ivan and Melly on WAMN News.
Thanks, Leo. Tonight on WAMN News, facing the 9th wave of COVID, an exclusive opinion polls underway as Western Australians share their views on whether they are well prepared before Christmas.
Also tonight, 300 kilometres and counting. Aishwarya's father completes his epic walking journey in memory of his daughter.
Masks to be mandatory in WA's public hospitals again as the number of COVID cases spike.
Good times with special guests. WAMN News' Sundowner coming next Friday. And later, Dr. Andrew Miller's comment. Join us tonight on the WAMN News Facebook page and YouTube channel.
Let's get a recap of the top stories we're following on 6 News this hour. And dozens of people have been killed after 2 Israeli strikes on schools in Gaza. Thousands of people are housed at the schools due to the war. The Palestinian Health Ministry saying hundreds were injured in the strikes, with at least 50 killed. And the Victorian Labor Party has been re-elected in the state seat of Mulgrave in a by-election last night, despite a swing of more than 10% away from them. The election was triggered by the resignation of former Premier Dan Andrews, Labor suffering a swing of more than 10%, but retained the seat against both the Liberals and high-profile independent Ian Cook. And that is 6 News for now. You can stay up to date by heading to our website and following us on social media at SIXNewsAU. News is on the hour, every hour here on 6 News. For now, though, I'm Leonardo Puglisi. Thanks for your company. Good night.
When news breaks